Hi everybody, and welcome to today's AOP live webinar. So my name is Philip Ideson. I'm the founder and managing director here at Art of Procurement, and delighted, as always, to be joined by my co-founder, Kelly Barner. Kelly, thanks for joining me, helping me facilitate the conversation today.
Or knowing who our two guests are today, wrangle them up.
It is going to be a fun one.
Yeah.
Our guests, I think, are some of our closest friends in the industry, and we've got lots of things to talk about. We'll get to that in a minute. But before we go there, I'll just, if this is your first AOP Live, really is all about the conversation. Now you'll see within the event platform here that there is chat box on the right-hand side. I'm always having to check, is it the right, is it the left? I'm never very good with my right and left, but I think I'm there on the right-hand side. And you can just pop in any questions, any comments as we go throughout the conversation. Both Kelly and I will be keeping an eye on that as we go through the next 45, 50 minutes or so, and we'll bring in any comments and questions as we can at the right time into the conversation. So please don't be shy. Now, the topic itself is procurement outsourcing, perception versus reality. Really interesting topic, something I really like talking about as well. So we've definitely got lots of things and lots of experiences to share, but we're going to also be talking about how you're measuring, or how can you measure procurement's impact when outsourcing is involved. And are we ready to have a new conversation about outsourcing? It's interesting how the terminology has changed as well over the past few years. You know, it's probably, I don't know, it's 2007, 2008 when I was involved in this for the first time. Then it was outsourcing, then it moved to services. Now it's a little bit of outsourcing again. So we'll explore that a little bit as well. Now, our guests, we're going to be joined by Joe Payne. Joe is Senior Vice President of Sourcing and Procurement at Corcentric, and Anthony Mignogna. Anthony is Vice President of Sales and Solution Engineering, also at Corcentric. So let's bring Joe and Anthony on stage to join us. Here we go. And Joe, you win the prize for the first camera on. Appreciate you joining us today, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks for having likewise, us. Phil.
So let's just, as we kind of get into the conversation, Anthony, I kind of mentioned this as I was just doing the intro around the terminology of outsourcing. So what does outsourcing mean in real life?
I think there's lots of perceptions, right? When I think of outsourcing, you think like cheap and far, right? Mm-hmm. It's kind of your first thing that comes to mind. I think a lot of people think it's kind of an all or nothing proposition. I think where, especially as it relates to, business processes and business functions, it's not necessarily always cheap and far. It's not always necessarily an all or nothing. We look at it much more as an augmentation and extension of the team. And it's almost, like a third-party service, in other areas of your business that, people are completely used to, quote unquote, outsourcing things like facilities management or janitorial services, right? Because you just don't think it's best to highest use of your organization to manage that business process of that function or that requirement. Same can be said for things like procurement and, various back office functions.
Yeah. Well. So when we hear the term procurement services, for example, or third-party services, it's really alluding to the same thing. It's just different words to mean the same kind of intention.
Yeah, exactly. Where can you kind of augment your team with somebody else's expertise, right? Or bandwidth.
So Joe, I don't know if this is a leading question or not, but you've been involved in procurement outsourcing for a long time. How many jobs or roles would you say you've outsourced during your career?
Yeah, well, I knew this question was coming, so we went back into the files and did some research to calculate the exact number. And turns out it's 0.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, so why is that, right? It kind of ties to what Anthony was talking about, that what we call outsourcing isn't really outsourcing in a traditional sense. It's not a lift and shift model, the one that we support and that we think is the best fit for procurement. It's really to be an extension or enhancement resource that you can tap into at the right time for the right given need. And I honestly have a lot of conversations with procurement and finance leaders that are looking for some kind of third-party solution, the build versus buy or the lift and shift. And, the theme that I always like, the context I always give them and the recommendation is don't fully outsource procurement or leverage a third party to support procurement, but rather, make it a blended model.
Yeah.
You should always have some level of internal procurement capabilities, and it should be the most strategic elements of procurement at the very least. And why is that? It's because I think, and I probably said this on your show before, but I think more than any other part of the organization, procurement can have an impact that creates a competitive advantage, right? Because if you engage your supply base in the right way, you might not be the biggest customer out there, right, and have the most volume, but if you engage your suppliers in the right way, get them motivated to work with you, get them interested in working with you, then it's kind of like any relationship, right? If you treat them well and do it the right way, honestly and fairly and openly, they will give you first access to new technologies. They will give you higher service levels. They will give you, at times of capacity constraints, first access to the capacity that's available, and they'll give you a lower pricing, right? But so in that vein, you want to have a strategic procurement element in-house, and then it's a matter of figuring out what is the balance and where is it that I can leverage a third party to maximize my ROI and to kind of optimize my staffing model.
Yeah, it's interesting when we think about the history of procurement outsourcing, probably when it was in its infancy, and I'd say this is probably, around the 2007, 2008 period, it was more around lift and shift. Let's buy this black box of procurement.
Right.
And, those models lasted for maybe a deal cycle or two. So 3-5 years later, you're kind of realizing that that's not the model. That's not the model that's going to stick, and it is all going to be about hybrid and how you're going to build these in-source, outsource kind of models. And that's really where we've been for the last 10 plus years, I think, from a typical delivery model. So some of those kind of old perceptions of, I'm going to just lift and shift my procurement team to a third party. You don't see those out in the wild so much anymore.
Sure. And so then you have to kind of figure out then what is the best model? Because in that cyclical nature, the tendency is to then fully in-house it, right? And that's not necessarily the answer either. And so I think we'll get into some of the reasons why and the best way to do that later on. Yeah,
and let's bring up the poll. So we always do a LinkedIn poll in advance of webinars like this, where it's really just to get kind of a pulse check on our community's perspective on a particular question or issue. We asked this, and we were only able to ask 4 answers. I'm going to read this out in its entirety just for anybody who's not watching but's listening. We asked, procurement outsourcing is ... Is it key to procurement efficiency? Something that I should look into? Is it obsolete in a digital age, or is it a threat to our careers? And so the response was 53% said key to procurement efficiency. 19% said something I should look into. 19% also said obsolete in a digital age, and 8% said a threat to our careers. It's good that the 8% is as low as what it is, because I think that was always one of those kind of challenges with the perception of procurement. But anything there that kind of stands out to you? And Anthony, I'll ask you that first.
I think I generally agree that it's a key to procurement efficiency. I don't think that maybe the behavior that I see out in the wild, to use your phrase, I kind of like that, is necessarily that 1 in 10 consider it a threat to the career. I think there's a lot more of that. Whether people willing to admit it or not, if you're hired to do procurement, it's tough. It's a tough sell to say, I'm going to hire somebody else to help me do the procurement, right? But that's where, and I think we'll get into it a little bit, but understanding kind of what that right fit is, what, right people, right seat, and how that works. I think the obsolete in the digital age is an interesting option. I didn't think of that as a question prompt, and that 20% think that it's obsolete. I I think the digital actually enhances the ability for those outsourcing organizations to be even, bigger, stronger, faster as an option, because, it's what they do for a living, right? So they're going to be best deploying those digital solutions, AI, RPA, those types of things to their best and highest use, right? Versus kind of an organization that's just figuring it out for themselves.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say, because I was going to ask you about the obsolete in a digital age, because you've got, probably even deeper experience on the digital side of procurement than on the procurement outsourcing side. So you kind of, how do you kind of see the two complementing each other rather than one replacing the other?
Yeah, because the only way you can be more efficient than an in-house solution is to be, better, faster, stronger, like I said, right? And you're going to need to leverage those technology solutions, and who better to figure that out than someone whose job it is to figure that out, right? So I actually look at it as an enhancement to an outsourcing model than a replacement, for sure.
Joe, were you surprised to see over half the respondents actually looking at procurement outsourcing as something that's key to procurement efficiency?
I was actually pleasantly surprised by the results of this poll, in that you take those first two, it's 72% are either in alignment that it's needed or are interested in looking into it. And it's just, as Anthony noted, it's just not, it hasn't been traditionally our experience, but it's good to see that the market is moving in that direction, where there's this realization that tapping into a third party, not necessarily fully outsourcing, but tapping into it, creates efficiency. I do see it as a theme for some of our, I would say, best customers. Yeah. Like they've recognized that, but it's not what I experience. Like that, this survey doesn't represent the experience I typically see on a day-to-day basis.
Now, I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself with questions for later, but do you see that the economic cycle impacts the perception of utilizing third parties, augmenting your team with third parties? When business is great and there's lots of cash to be thrown around internally, it's something that's less considered. And when times are looking like they might be getting a little bit more strapped, then it's a potential delivery model, or is it really just based on each individual company?
No, I'd say that business cycles definitely impact the types of customers we see coming to us. I would just say that it's not necessarily a matter of like count or like number of customers. It's more about urgency, right? So when things aren't looking as good, when times are tight, revenues aren't hitting the way companies expected, and they've got cost-cutting measures coming, that's when the urgency goes way up. So I don't necessarily see like a spike in demand at those times, just decisions being made a lot more quickly. Yeah. And then in better times, I still see a lot of companies trying to strive for continuous improvement, doing more with less, or just looking to stay out of a rut of, doing things the same all the time. But in those instances, time is on their side, right? So it might a cycle or discussion could take months versus when times are tighter, when it could be, days or weeks.
And I see a great question from Zelim as well. I'm going to come back to that later in the conversation. I didn't want to just think that you hadn't seen that and was going to ignore it, but I think it's a great question to bring in later in the conversation. That being said, Kelly, what were some of your thoughts on this survey?
Well, it's interesting because listening to sort of what you had said in the lead and then listening to what Anthony said in response to the survey, it occurs to me that it's not just procurement outsourcing that can make procurement into a black box. That if procurement goes for funding, and we actually also have a question that came into the Q&A about that. If you're trying to build a business case where you're saying, I need to bring in some type of targeted expertise to help my team, either around knowledge or around bandwidth. As Anthony had said, if the business looks at it as, oh, you all do the procurement, then it's going to be very difficult to make that case. And so part of what procurement needs to be thinking about is certainly not going back to that old black box outsourced model where you say, oh, we're just going to, lift and shift the tasks over there. But but making sure that the company now understands all of the knowledge and intricacies and policy changes and working with suppliers that actually go into procurement, because there's a lot that's covered by that word procurement from a skills and talent and capability perspective. Now, it's funny too. I also thought the 19% around it being digital, I feel like it's mandatory in 2024. Doesn't matter what you're talking about. It could be turtles. You have to ask about AI also. And so as we start to think about maybe dispelling some of the myths that people might hold around outsourcing, Joe, let me come to you. Actually, I'm going to pull the survey down. I'm so focused on the conversation of where we're going. Let me come to you and ask about this. As we think about procurement's objectives, outsourcing is one way to try to succeed or have the type of impact we're looking to, but AI is being sort of forwarded as the answer to everything. It's the golden ticket. It's the solution. It's the promise we've been waiting for. How likely is AI to be the answer to our challenges and needs versus something that's been around a long time, but maybe hasn't been discussed as much recently, like procurement outsourcing?
Yeah, AI is certainly the talk of the town, right? And Anthony and I just had a customer that the decision they made, which was between outsourcing and AI, and they went with AI. And if you think about that, even a year ago, I would have said that there's just no way that would be what we'd be talking about today. But it's the reality. And I would say that kind of alluding to what Anthony was saying earlier, related to just technology in general, it really shouldn't be an A or B kind of decision, right? It should be kind of, how do I blend A and B together, right? So like, if you think about where we often are brought into a discussion, it's with an early stage effort to centralize a procurement function within one of our customers, right? They had some level of decentralized, maybe just for indirects, maybe across the board. And now they're trying to centralize that function and turn it into something that generates value for the company. And they're saying, okay, well, should I bring in a third party to help me with this? Or should I bring in this case, AI, right? We used to say just technology, but now really it is more of an AI discussion. And so, to that, I would, say, well, let's think about any early stage procurement organization. What's the first thing that they struggle with? Spend visibility. How is AI going to fix your spend visibility problem, right? Sure, technology can help create spend visibility, but you also need some subject matter expertise. You need to have an approach, right? How do you want to create your taxonomy? How is your business structure and how do you align to that, right? So it's a blend of people and technology coming together to enable that to happen. And in the most mature organizations that have already gotten a rock solid process, have had a long-standing technology solution with a lot of compliance to it, and a pretty strong policy and some teeth behind a policy, that's where AI can come in today and have an immediate impact, right? Because you've got good data, you've got good process, and now it's just taking that to the next level. If you don't know what you're buying, getting AI to figure out how to source that it's not going to work, right? And so we are still having those conversations today. I think there's just a little more education that's needed in the market, that AI doesn't take technology and people and put it together in this magic thing. It still needs to be coached and trained. And if you have bad processes, if you have lack of compliance, AI is not going to fix those problems. You're still going to need human beings to come in and take the brunt of that work to make the AI work right.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because you talked about sort of in the opening to our conversation that your grand career total jobs outsourced is 0. And kudos, Phil, for picking up on the fact that was a loaded question that actually required you paying attention to recognize I had probably written some sarcasm into that. But how often is procurement truly the consumer or potential consumer internally of outsourcing? And how often is it somebody else, finance, ops, saying, hey, is this something we need to keep in-house, or is this something that we move? I mean, I think when people start to get nervous, that 8%, right, you're coming to take my job, you're sort of envisioning this, the CFO decides one day we don't want procurement in-house anymore, right? So we're just going to outsource the whole thing. But mostly what we've talked about today is procurement outsourcing some portion of their responsibilities, either around knowledge or types of transactions. What tends to be the common case? Joe, that's a follow-up question for you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's still, the typical consultant answer, but it's still 50-50. What I see is between procurement coming looking for a solution, or most cases like finance, or like a head of supply chain or operations coming and looking for the solution. So it's pretty evenly split between what we see. The rationale behind it can be very different, right? So
Sure.
when procurement comes to us, it's more around the top responders in that poll, right, that are saying, I need to be more efficient. If you think about the natural ebbs and flows of the function, where even if you're the most mature procurement and sourcing function, and you have a roadmap, and you know what categories you're going to hit and the expected impact of those categories, and then all of a sudden the business comes in and says, oh, we're going to buy our largest competitor, or we're going to build a new facility in China, or X, Y, and Z, right? All these different things could happen. And so suddenly your capacity plan just went out the window. And so those are the types of things that are the reasons procurement are coming to us is, I've got a spike or a natural increase and decrease in demand over time.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really make sense for me to hire FTEs to address that. And then the second reason is more in line with why a finance group might come to us, but a procurement group would come to us as well and say, I've suddenly got a new savings goal, or the first time we have a savings goal, we've got 12 months to hit it, and I don't have enough people or the right subject matter expertise to go after everything I need to get to that savings number. And so I need to tap into a third party to enable that. So those are like the two reasons that procurement would bring us in. Finance would also bring us in to hit the savings target, but they're looking at it in one of two ways. One, they don't have centralized procurement. And so they're saying, instead of me investing and knowing that it's going to take me 1, 2, 3 years to ramp that function up before I start seeing the results I want to tap into a plug and play model that will get me there and then can go away in some element over time once they do their work. Or they've recognized, look, our procurement function hasn't really accomplished what we need it to. We need to tap into some third-party expertise to help get it to where we need it to be. And typically that's a finance leader or an ops leader that maybe came from a more mature procurement function and then moved to a new company and saw, it's going to take me years to build this. So let's just bring in a third party and fast track that effort.
Yeah. Well, and if we think about that relative maturity and the relative efficiency that hopefully goes with it, Anthony, we had that 53% of people that responded to the survey saying it's key to procurement efficiency. If LinkedIn allowed, I would love to ask those 53%, okay, then how many of you are using it? Right? It doesn't necessarily apply that they're using it. But when we think about specifically how procurement outsourcing, when well applied, can make procurement more efficient, what are some benefits, some approaches that you see companies using successfully?
Yeah, I think Joe was kind of tapping into this a little bit, right? Like a lot of times where different aspects of procurement comes down to a DIY conversation, right, versus an outsourced conversation. So, then there's some people that prefer more the do-it-yourself model, right? When you talk about AI, do you want to, invest in it, figure it out how to best deploy it, that technology for your own use, or do you want to get kind of AI as a service where somebody's kind of already figured that out for you? The two questions I often ask is, as it relates to different business processes, is can you do this well, and do you want to, right? And if the answer to either of those is no, then an outsourcing or managed service type answer is probably the best fit, because if you can't do it well, if you can't do it efficiently, it behooves you to find somebody else that can. And sometimes you can do something, but you really just don't want to manage that business process right in-house because it just doesn't make sense for your organization. In which case, leveraging a third party would be an appropriate answer.
Yeah, that actually ties in nicely to a question that Caesar posted in the chat. When you think about whether it's efficiency or just effectiveness, do you typically either recommend or see companies saying, wow, this is a really inefficient or broken process, I should outsource it as a means of fixing it? Or does it tend to be more common or a more recommended best practice to say, no, fix the process first and then outsource it? So Anthony, I'll start with you there, and then Joe, we'll see if you have anything that you would add in response to Caesar.
Yeah, I think the tendency is to equate efficiency with technology, right? I think it's 2024. It's just how our brains have been conditioned. There's an app for that. Like, go find it on the App Store and download it. And so, when you look at a inefficient process, right? Instinct is technology, automate, right? AI, whatever. I look at efficiency first through the lens of elimination, right? So what things can we actually just eliminate the task through various ways? And, one of those ways might be by outsourcing it, right? One of those ways is likely going to be, process change. And even when you move into the next step, which is automation, which is likely going to leverage some sort of technology, when you're moving from, to, you have to change the process in order to maximize the utilization of that investment, right? So I think typical behavior is to try to make the existing process more efficient, but best practice behavior would be to fix the process and then optimize the future state.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, Joe, because I appreciate what Anthony's saying, and I think he's right. We do think this way, that we think, oh, you can either implement technology and that's going to magically fix it, or you can outsource and maybe that magically fixes it. But we don't always get it right about what needs to be done to improve something before we implement technology or outsource a process. What do you tend to see around maybe that balance between improving it enough, but not also closing yourself off to the potential value that going through an implementation process or outsourcing to learn from somebody that's done this extremely well for a long time could potentially offer some value back? Do you know what I mean about that sort of trade-off? Don't take something broken and just chuck it over the wall. But at the same time, don't try to, make sure that there's an opportunity to learn, whether it's from the technology or if it's a third-party service provider.
Yeah, I would say, I think that question and the question Caesar posed, I only wish more of the customers that we engage with are even thinking in those terms, right? Like, it's normally not part of that initial decision-making process. It's like, let's take an easy technology example, right? I'm buried in paper and manual processes. Technology will fix that. And to Anthony's point around like the App Store, right? Like, I think a CFO thinks in those terms. Go to the App Store, click the app, and now we're fully automated. And then he hands that project. He just bought the app, right? And he hands that project to his team. And the team's like, yeah, but this app doesn't look like our process. We need to customize the app. We need to change this and this and this, right? And it's like, no, this represents the standard workflow that you should work towards. And so what we deal with when we get into those situations, it becomes, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but it becomes a change management conversation, quite honestly. And so we work really hard with the leaders that we work with in procurement and finance to start thinking about those questions as early as possible around what are you willing to change versus what are you absolutely not willing to change, because the best technology or the best outsourcing model in the world will not fix a broken process. It just won't.
Yeah.
And so what do we have to do? And that's where I think we add a lot of value, quite honestly, is because we're coming in and we're mapping out end-to-end processes and we're showing them where the bottlenecks are. That's just a standard deployment model for us to do that, and then to make some decisions around that as early as possible. But it requires a lot of engagement and a lot of change management to get that done, even in an organization that has signed on to a transformational initiative, right?
They think you're going to come in and say, you don't need to
change.
change anything. You're perfect just the way you are.
That's right.
Now, Phil, to actually pull you in and get your thoughts on this for a second, we've been talking about sort of the app, and I get it. Like, we're sort of joking, like you can just flip the switch and pick your colors. Do you want night mode or day mode? And instantly you have procurement. But it is true that we live in sort of this experience economy. It's a time when we're worried about how are we impacting our stakeholders? What are our suppliers going to think? Because so much of what procurement does touches both groups in addition to affecting the company. Any thoughts from your perspective around how procurement outsourcing can or maybe even should impact stakeholders and suppliers?
Yeah, so I think about the output first of all, or what are you trying to achieve by procurement outsourcing? And you can look at the entire procurement continuum and kind of pick a part of the continuum to say this is kind of where we're focusing. But I'm thinking about this from a more of an upstream, from a sourcing and a category management perspective, where the outsourcing of capabilities within procurement is really to bring in a lot deeper subject matter expertise around particular categories or areas of spend that you may not have in-house, because in-house you may just have a generalist. So where that's the case, you now have a subject matter expert that is actually facing off against suppliers and stakeholders. For suppliers, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. So on one hand, they now know that they're dealing with somebody who understands the market dynamics of what they're trying to price into, that understands the pricing, that there isn't necessarily wool that can be pulled over anybody's eyes in terms of contractual, just terms in the contracts or pricing or whatever it is, but also that speeds the discovery process, because they know that you're not going to need 5 rounds of RFP negotiations to get to the pricing that the buyer wants, because the buyer knows where the pricing should be in the first place. As a supplier, you also know that you're working with somebody who is really intimately familiar with what you do and your industry and kind of your value proposition as well. So they can advocate internally. They can understand what are the right things that make the difference between you as a provider that would be a good provider and one that might not be the right fit. So I see it as being really, it can be a benefit for both sides, having somebody that has that subject matter expertise in place. Now, for stakeholders, I think it's interesting because, again, comparing it versus somebody who may be more of a generalist, and that was what I was, so I don't want to kind of look down on a generalist, but if you have a specialist in place versus a generalist that you brought on board with a procurement outsourcer, then they're going to be able to help you as a stakeholder think about probably more options to drive the outputs that you're trying to drive. Who are different suppliers that you may not have thought about that you've come into place? They're probably going to help the stakeholder kind of de-risk changing suppliers, because they've seen these suppliers in the past. If you go and use somebody else to source something else. So I see this as being a positive. When you think about the alternative being somebody that perhaps understands how to run the procurement process but doesn't have that in-depth knowledge around specific categories of spend. And so I think that, one of the things that's most important, and Joe was talking about change management. I've seen that culture is also a really big factor internally into not even necessarily whether you should outsource or not, but more how do you make sure you maximize the value of your investment in procurement outsourcing. And a big part of that is figuring out what do you keep and what do you outsource, kind of what are the tasks. Anthony, I'm going to ask this to you first, but Joe, please feel free to jump in because I know you've got some opinions on this. How do you advise people to think about what to keep versus what to outsource?
Yeah, I think, I kind of said it earlier, my little 2x2 I use of can you do this well and do you want to is the central question, right? But then it's kind of going through process by process, right? If you think about the end-to-end of, having category expertise, running a sourcing event, do those need to be performed by the same person or can they be decoupled? onboarding a supplier, managing a contract, right? Executing purchase orders, managing the full kind of P2P life cycle, all the way through payment. Each of those has different elements to it that, as we've kind of been dancing around just the people, process, technology, which is just your typical consulting term, I guess, right? But the process is the foundation, right? The technology is the enabler, and then when you think of the people, it's a right people, right seat, right? So what core competencies do you have that make sense to keep in house? What core competencies do you not have that make sense to potentially leverage a third party to in that future state process?
Yeah, I would I think add to your 2x2 one more, which would be should you, right? Should you be doing it?
Yeah.
And to that end, kind of as we were talking about earlier, that idea of what brings, if procurement can create a competitive advantage through both supplier engagement as well as stakeholder, I would call it stakeholder enablement, right? So when you've got key stakeholders in, like think about on the direct side in engineering and product marketing and all these other areas, right, that are looking for insights into what they should be doing or what they should be considering for future business needs, who better than suppliers to tell you what other companies are doing or what they're thinking about, right? So if you can connect those dots and provide those insights from the suppliers into the internal stakeholders, and it applies in every area, not just directs, right? And indirects, think about like marketing, right? Or HR. What are other HR groups doing here? Mm-hmm. You want people on your internal team to be able to help facilitate that. But do you really need them to do all the work behind it, right? If we think about that subject matter expert that you mentioned, Phil, in a direct material situation, yeah, you want an in-house person. But for a category, say like telecommunications, you might look at your spend and say, oh, I've got, north of 10 million in telecom spend. I need somebody full-time on this. But if you're sourcing it every 3 years, maybe you don't, right? Maybe that's where you kind of tap into those things. And so, that's where the should comes in is, yeah, I kind of want to do this in-house, but maybe I shouldn't because the model itself doesn't necessarily generate the ROI or create the flexibility that I'm trying to gain from my internal team and what I'm trying to build in-house versus extend out to a third party.
Yeah, and just to add on that, I think about where do you have advocates in the organization for what you're trying to achieve? Yeah. I think when I look at procurement outsourcing deals that I've been involved in that didn't go the way that everybody hoped, it was because the way they were scoped was in a way that brought spend categories, for example, so this is more upstream, brought spend categories into scope where the circumstances weren't right and ready yet for those categories to be. So you have categories of spend that you look at and think, and marketing is always a great example. Lots of opportunity in marketing. We've never really had success there. Let's bring an expert in to go and manage that. Well, there might be lots of reasons why there's been resistance for procurement, and bringing an expert is not going to just unlock the door in a lot of cases because it's more about the culture that we talked about. So what are the categories of spend where you have advocates, where it's kind of an easier way for you to demonstrate ROI that then allows you to build into some of those more complex categories. And too often I just see deals that have been done that are going after the wrong categories too quickly.
Yep.
Yeah, I think, I was just going to say, Phil, we oftentimes will build a roadmap, right? Yeah. Because you can't do everything all at once. And so, that's kind of key and critical to rack, stack, and prioritize where you're going to start, right? And, where you're going to go next and where you're going to end up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when we do those roadmaps, I think we tend to do them in a way that aligns to what you were saying, Phil, which is, that misconception of, oh, we've got, $1 billion of spend and the top categories are HR benefits and, taxes or something, right? Like you're not going to start with those areas. You're not going to start by going in and getting a new auditor for your CFO or touching your HR benefits. So they're big spend areas, but they're not and you're not going to start there.
Yeah. Like the marketing, you can go and do promotional products, but you're not really going to start with creative agencies.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have a question that came in earlier from Yati, who's asking, how do you overcome the challenge of the prospect or client organization struggling to find internal budget to justify engaging an outsourcing or augmented third-party solution provider? So building the business case, making the case for money that might not exist already. Any advice or tips? Anthony, I'll start and ask you that. But again, Joe, feel free to jump in too.
Yeah, I mean, every one of these engagements that we have with our customers got a pretty rock solid business case. That's going to be, you're going to want it to be data driven. And, something that I say all the time that seems obvious, but isn't always, is to be completely outcome focused, right? Mm-hmm. What problems are you trying to solve? What outcomes are you trying to achieve? And then how you paint the picture that this investment is going to get there. I do think, Phil, you used the term earlier to de-risk your investment. I do think that, when you're making the business case for outsourcing, leveraging a third party or managed services engagement, you're not just making the business case against the current state, you're also making the business case against the alternative, right? And so, that why statement is really important. And painting the picture that, that an outsourcing actually does de-risk the investment, right? Mm-hmm. Because the business case is typically, oftentimes higher cost, but oftentimes higher value, right? Where that responsibility is a shared objective. And I think that's, critical to when you're setting up those engagements and make sure that, obviously the scope of work is important and who's going to do what, when, and how, but also that, those objectives are shared across parties, so that everybody's kind of swimming in the same direction.
Yeah, I would say there's two ways that I see it being approached, right? One is the way a typical customer who's challenged with those budget constraints is going to approach it is they're gonna try to come up with a contract that guarantees a result.
Yeah.
Right? You said that we're going to save 10%. So if we don't save 10%, we want you to pay us the 10%, or we want our money back. And you'll get firms that will do some level of contingency or will, create some guarantee. But at the end of the day, then you end up playing with numbers, right? You just tend to kind of, 10% included cost avoidance and included all these things, right? Because the provider is trying to make sure they don't have to give any money back. Mm-hmm. And then they're in conflict with the result, which is, or the goal, which was, let's get as much done as we can with a third party assisting us. And then the way you can but the way that makes more sense is, I think, the way that we try to approach it, but not all providers will do, which is a pilot, right? Mm-hmm. How do you do it? Proof of concept. Easiest way to do it is proof of concept. If we can align on a scope and a mission that we know is achievable together, because yes, you're using a third party, but if you're not going to support it, if we don't have change management in place, if we don't have good sponsorship, there's limited that we can do. Let's put a proof of concept together and let's show how we can do it. But the problem that we'll have on the customer side is it's hard to find, quite honestly, suppliers that will do a proof of concept in an outsourcing model, mm-hmm. right? Even though we're talking about outsourcing has kind of gone away and it's tapping into a service, almost a shared service or like a service as a service model. The reality is, especially the bigger firms still want 5-year contracts. They still want guaranteed minimum amount of FTE to commit. And so it's hard to get a proof of concept up and running, especially in the mid-market. Larger market, it might be easier to do, but in the mid-market, or if you're a smaller size company, getting a third party to engage in a proof of concept, it's not necessarily something they're all interested in. But I think it's really important and something that more folks should do, because it kind of shows both sides. Is this going to work for us, right? Is it going to be something that creates a real result, or is it going to be something that, like you said, Phil, you're starting in the wrong areas and maybe you're not culturally aligned yet to use a third party or to get that kind of support?
So as organizations are thinking about outsourcing, are there certain things that they should know about their requirements before coming and talking to, potential partners?
Yeah.
And Joe, I'll ask that if you want to give that a go. What should they know? What should they come to you knowing before they
They
start?
should really do an honest assessment, like of the company culture and the reality that impact that outsourcing is going to have. Now, can they all do that? It depends, right? If you're coming and looking for a third party and you've been with the same organization for 10, 15, 20 years, and maybe you're moving to a centralized model or a new model that you haven't done before, it's kind of hard to visualize what impact tapping into a third party is going to have. If you've come from a more mature organization or if you've tried it before, then it's a bit easier to figure out what the organization can and can't digest. But even in that model, like that first model, maybe maybe you don't have that perspective, but maybe some of your colleagues do, right? And so to talk it out, right, internally and get that alignment before you go out looking for an answer. It's not quite the same as an outsourcing model, right? But on the technology side, when we're out working, with customers that come to us that are looking for procure to pay technology, 9 times out of 10, procurement's coming before they talk to AP, or AP's coming before they talk to procurement, right? And this is P to P, right? but they don't, right? And so it's, what can you do to get that internal alignment a little bit beforehand? Yeah. And sometimes that means bringing in a consultant or a third party to help scope out what is even reasonable to digest before you move to that next step.
Kelly, I know you've been keeping a look on the chat and any questions that have been coming in. I wonder if there's just anything that you've seen coming across to pose to Joe or to Anthony.
I have, yes. And in fact, one that just came in, I'm very curious to know the answer to this. Anthony or Joe, you can raise your hand. Have either of you guys actually seen a company outsource 99% of their procurement? And let's fill that in, say, responsibility. So not just headcount where you're moving it, but Joe, you talked about some teams that maybe don't have centralized procurement yet. Have you seen any companies successfully fulfill 99% of that scope through a third party?
Yeah, I have. I guess the key part of that question is successfully, right? Because it ties back to what Phil was saying right at the beginning, which is it's a cyclical model. So when you do full outsourcing, it's typically going to be a 5-year contract. I have never seen that level of outsourcing continue after 5 years because the results stagnate after year 3, right? You can't get the same savings year after year. Once you get it, the savings are going to go down every year. And so the trend lines start going in the wrong direction, not necessarily as a result of anything tied to the firm that was doing the outsourcing. It's just the diminishing returns, right? And then
it's funny how every single one of those deals takes exactly the same path. Doesn't it? That happened. And because the business conditions changed, like you wrote this deal 5 years ago or 3 years ago, and you're in a completely different space as a business now 3 years later, and it just isn't fit for purpose anymore.
Well, I think that's why there's a kind of ongoing struggle on 3 or 5 year deals. I mean, even in the technology space, but businesses now change so quickly. You're telling me you want me to sign a deal in 5 years, right? Think about 5 years ago versus, we didn't even know if COVID was 5 years ago. I've never even heard of it. So it's a long time. And businesses change very, very quickly. And so to your point, Phil, that's another reason why at the end, I've never seen how most of the time I see the model take the inverse and go from 100% or 99% outsourced to fully insourced. It's almost a rubber band or a whiplash effect.
Yeah. Now, the other interesting question here, and Anthony, maybe I'll direct this to you, and then, of course, anybody else, including Phil, if you guys have something that you want to add. We've talked about making business cases and winning sort of presumably the CFO or the head of operations over to the idea of outsourcing some portion of procurement. And so that requires defined scope, it requires budget, commitment. But sometimes there's a business case to be made inside of procurement first. And so as much as we've talked about dispelling myths a little bit today, you might have somebody in procurement that has seen something very successfully outsourced at another company, but now they work for a team where outsourcing is still sort of a dirty word. Anthony, have you seen any cases where one person within procurement has had to make the business case to somebody else within procurement before finance or operations or anybody else is involved in the conversation to say, should we even start putting this business case together or evaluating the viability of this as an option, to sort of win people with different philosophies and backgrounds over to the potential of outsourcing?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of why statement, or that idea of the art of the possible is a story that needs to be told first and foremost, right? To the folks that need to support it, right? To get to the next level of stakeholders that need to support it. Kind of piggybacking off of one of the conversations earlier around requirements, I do think that there's a bit of a habit, for lack of a better word, within procurement to just over invest in the requirements. And what ends up happening is the requirements become a list of what you're doing today. And so I think one of the ways to help kind of paint the picture is to, think of requirements less of kind of a list of things that you need, and think of it through the lens of constraints, right? So what are the constraints you have to work around? And then kind of what I said before, what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve, right? If you take constraints and outcomes and, position that to the market, you're going to get a lot more creative solutions, right? To your problems, or creative paths to those business outcomes that might be different than what kind of the preconceived notions might be in-house already. And that's going to help you a lot when not just building that business case, but also kind of painting that picture.
Yeah. And if I can sneak in one more question here, this in a way almost brings us full circle to where we started, because we sort of opened the conversation with what is outsourcing? And it's not just what does it mean, but where does outsourcing end and third-party services begin? When should we be looking at AI? And somebody's posted a question here that also reminds me, there's also contingent workforce, which can potentially be pulled in to procurement to fill different kinds of roles. And so, Joe, when you think about not just defining all the different types of sort of service pockets, but really sitting down to figure out, what do we truly need? What is the best way to fill them? It feels nice to get to the solution. So I think a lot of us probably have a tendency to jump to like, yes, it's AI, and we're just going to go down the path of AI. But it's almost stopping before you get there to say, we're not going to start documenting our requirements for AI yet. We're going to make AI, contingent workforce, third-party services, traditional outsourcing, sort of duke it out and figure out which one of those is the right road to go down. Can that be a hard place for procurement to spend time, because it is so natural to want to sort of move faster to specs and requirements and making the business case for something more specific?
I think it is tough for procurement to do that. And, just real quick on that idea of contingent workforce, right? I see that as probably the worst way to tap into a third party to support a procurement function. And it's because if you really are trying to be more strategic and kind of build up the function, you're basically saying like an apple's an apple, and like every procurement resource is the same quality. And out there, it's just so inconsistent, right? And so you're spending time ramping up people, training individuals, getting them up to speed, and they might leave, after a month for something better. And versus a managed service or a third, a fully outsourced or full outsourced model, where you've got an account management layer, you've got governance that's being established and things like that, and SLAs, so that you have a standard that's being managed for you versus a standard that you have to manage that comes from contingent workforce. But I mean, getting back to that point, right? When you're getting to that layer of like defining the requirements, this is where I think procurement tends to get very hung up, because we're procurement. We want a rock solid SOW that
Yeah.
defines everything and has every possible scenario in it. And that requires a tremendous amount of planning and what if analysis of how a model might work. But it also goes, it kind of conflicts with the idea that what you want to tap into is something that is scalable and flexible and allows you the right resource at the right time, right? So you're going from you're kind of fighting between scalability and predictability. So I would say that's one thing that's always a constraint we see, or kind of a conflict when we're going into these situations. But I guess to answer your question more directly, you're never going to figure everything out, right? So the best thing you can do is sit down and really do a thorough assessment of your internal organization. Where is procurement from a maturity perspective, right? Are you completely decentralized? Are you 100% spend on PO? Like, where in between those two things are you? And then what's the best case model for that? And that model, by the way, should likely not be one that is a technology or services model, but it should blend those two things, right? And it should blend those two things in a way that maximizes your flexibility, because to Phil's point, in 3 years or 5 years or even 1 year, the model, you might have a completely different set of objectives. You might have a completely different leadership team. You might have bought your biggest competitor. And so you have to understand that unless you want to change the providers and change the technologies every time those things happen, then really the main thing you're looking for is flexibility and scalability.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a great point. And these are terrific questions. We did also get a comment in here that people have enjoyed the conversation. So thank you, Joe and Anthony, both for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you answered the contingent worker question in the way you did, because it's essentially you are hiring somebody to do an FTE kind of role. Or what I mean is you still have the same requirements on performance, on management, on all the things. So it's a bum on a seat, to put it that way, as opposed to, a service that's going to help me kind of transform the way that I am working with my third parties and all the outputs. And so sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And it's a little bit of a luck game, which, when it works is great, but the chances of it doing are not high. And Zena mentioned that point as well, just in a response. Looking through all the comments here, we've had a lot of great engagement. So I don't think there's anything. Well, there's a couple of questions that we probably didn't have time to bring up that I would have liked to have done otherwise. But this is a topic that we can talk on, I think, probably all day and all night. Yeah. So I want to thank you, everybody, for joining us today in the conversation, for posing the questions, and for being a part of the conversation. And Joe and Anthony, as always, thanks for joining us on the webinar.
Thank you.
All
right.
Fun as always.
We'll speak to everybody again soon, I am sure. But until then, enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everybody.